At a crowded train station, a young black woman was hurrying to an important meeting to secure funding for her project. Suddenly, she spotted an elderly blind man being jostled and stumbling in the rush. Without a moment's hesitation, she stopped to help, knowing it might cost her the train. What she didn't expect was that this small act of kindness would one day return to her in a way she could never have imagined. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The morning air bit through Naomi's coat as she pushed through the sea of bodies flooding Rockford Central Station. Her breath fogged the cold glass panels above, the metallic echo of rolling suitcases and shuffling boots bouncing off the high arched ceiling. She clutched her folder tighter against her chest, feeling the ridged edge of her presentation slides beneath her fingers. This was it. The meeting she had been preparing for months, her one chance to pitch the community project she believed could change lives. The digital clock over the platform gates read 8:57 a.m., 3 minutes until departure. If she missed this train, she might as well kiss the opportunity goodbye. She maneuvered through the crowd, her eyes locked on the platform sign glowing in the distance. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a sudden disturbance in the current of commuters. A man, older, white hair swept thin across his head, stood frozen near the train doors. One hand gripped a worn cane, the other holding a bulging canvas bag. His dark glasses caught the station's overhead light, and the faint tremor in his chin told her what the rest of the crowd had already decided to ignore. He couldn't see. The tide of passengers pushed past him without slowing. Naomi saw the moment it happened. The cane's tip wedged itself into the narrow gap between the metal boarding ramp and the platform floor. The man tried to pull it free, but the bag's weight tugged at his shoulder, throwing him off balance. A woman nearby bent down, yanked the cane loose with a careless jerk, muttered something Naomi couldn't hear, and was gone before he could even steady himself. He took a half-step forward, disoriented, swaying in the cold air, the rush of boots and coats brushing past without a second glance. Naomi's gaze darted to the clock again. 8:58. Her train, her meeting. Months of late nights, carefully built arguments and hard-won statistics, all resting on the other side of those closing doors. She felt the weight of her own future pressing against her ribs, but so did the sight of him, alone, vulnerable, one wrong step away from falling. Before she could think herself out of it, her feet were already moving. She slipped between two men in heavy coats, sidestepping a wheeled suitcase, and reached the old man just as he started to lose his footing. "I've got you," she said, her voice steady despite the thud of her pulse. She slid the strap of his bag higher onto his shoulder, feeling the stiff canvas rough against her palm, and guided his hand to the smooth edge of the railing. The crowd surged again, threatening to pull them apart. She angled her body between him and the rush, shielding him from the sharp elbows and swinging backpacks. "Which platform?" she asked quickly. 5, he replied, his voice soft but certain. Platform 5 was on the opposite side. Naomi adjusted her grip and began steering him through the current, calling out gentle warnings as the ground shifted beneath their steps. Her breath came faster, the smell of diesel and damp wool filling her lungs. They reached the ramp just as the conductor blew the final whistle. She gave him a firm nod toward the open door. "You're here." He lifted his head toward her, the faintest smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Thank you." Naomi opened her mouth to answer, but the hiss of the sliding doors cut her off. The train she was meant to be on, the train carrying her toward that one-in-a-million opportunity, was already moving. She stood there, watching it glide out of the station, the tail lights disappearing into the gray morning fog. Her chest tightened, not from the cold but from the sharp, undeniable truth that she had just traded her chance for his safety. She exhaled slowly, a cloud of white curling upward, and managed a small quiet reply. "You're welcome." They stepped in opposite directions, swallowed by the crowd once more, unaware that the rails beneath them had just shifted in ways neither could yet see. Naomi stood for a long moment, the crowd flowing around her as if she were just another post holding up the station roof. She turned away from the empty tracks, the echoes of the departing train still rattling in her ears. By the time she reached the community hall 2 towns over, the meeting room door was already closed. Through the narrow glass panel, she saw another group at the podium, polished slides on the screen, confident voices filling the air. She could make out the faces of the council members, some leaning forward with interest, others jotting quick notes. Her own team sat near the back, 3 pairs of hopeful eyes finding hers as soon as she entered. She slid into the seat beside them, her breath still uneven from the rush. "I missed it," she whispered, the words tasting heavier than she expected. For a beat, no one spoke. Then Carla, the oldest in the group, placed a warm hand over Naomi's. "We'll find another way," she said, her tone steady. "The project's good. One meeting doesn't decide everything." The others nodded, not with blind optimism, but with the quiet stubbornness Naomi had always admired in them. She forced herself to return the smile, though the weight in her chest hadn't lifted. Outside the tall windows, the winter light was already fading, and Naomi wondered if the sacrifice she'd made that morning would ever mean more than a missed chance. She didn't know that the answer was already making its way toward her, on tracks she couldn't yet see. A week later, the bitter cold had eased, but the sky still hung low and gray over the town as Naomi pushed open the heavy glass doors of the public library. A wave of warm book-dusty air met her, mingled with the faint scent of brewed coffee from somewhere deep inside. She stepped inside, rubbing her hands together, her mind set on finding research materials for the accessibility portion of her project. The library was busier than usual. A folding sign in the lobby announced a special reading session for the visually impaired and children with disabilities. Volunteers were bustling around, arranging chairs in wide arcs, adjusting microphones, and setting out trays of hot cocoa cups with tiny marshmallows floating on top. She took the wide hallway toward the main collection, her boots muffled against the carpet, when she noticed a familiar shape at the far end of the corridor. An older man in a thick wool coat, his white cane tapping lightly against the floor. A tote bag, sagging with the weight of hardcovers, hung from his shoulder. It took her a moment to place him, but when she did, her breath caught. It was the man from the train station, the one she had helped up and guided through the chaos. "Holt," she almost called out, then stopped, realizing his concentration was fixed entirely on the next steps in front of him. A young staff member in a bright lanyard was hovering near him, juggling a stack of audiobooks in both arms. "We'll just head down these steps, sir," the young man said, already moving toward the narrow staircase. The elevator behind them bore a hand-lettered sign, "Out of order." Holt tapped forward cautiously, feeling for the first step, while the staffer tried to maneuver past him with the books. In a careless shift of weight, the young man's elbow caught Holt's tote bag, tipping it forward. A dozen books spilled out, tumbling down the short flight in a noisy scatter. Holt's balance wavered, 1 foot halfway into empty space. Naomi's pulse jolted. She closed the distance in seconds, her boots gripping the carpet as she reached out and caught Holt's arm before his momentum carried him forward. "I've got you," she said, steady but urgent. His cane clattered against the railing, but she kept her grip firm, anchoring him back onto the top step. "Easy now." The staffer froze, eyes wide, murmured a quick apology, and scrambled to retrieve the scattered books. Naomi crouched, gathering the remaining ones herself, large print editions, a few braille volumes, their raised dots catching the light. "Let's go one step at a time," she said quietly. She guided Holt's hand to the railing, then matched his pace, counting softly with each descent. His grip on her forearm was steady, trusting, and when they reached the bottom, he exhaled, as if releasing more than just held breath. "Thank you," he said, turning his head slightly toward her voice. "We seem to have a habit of meeting in places where I'm one step from disaster." Naomi smiled, easing his tote back onto his shoulder. "Maybe the world's trying to make sure you get where you're going." He chuckled at that, the sound warm in the quiet. Together they stepped into the reading room, where chairs were already filling with children and a few adults. In the corner, Naomi noticed a boy in a navy sweater sitting in a wheelchair, his small hands folded neatly in his lap. His eyes were fixed on the storyteller at the podium, a young woman with a calm, lyrical voice. For just a moment, the boy turned his head and caught Naomi's gaze. She smiled, and after a pause, he smiled back, a quiet exchange that lingered in her mind even as she took a seat near the back. The reading session unfolded in gentle rhythms, voices carrying well through the small space, punctuated by soft laughter from the children and the occasional rustle of turning pages. Holt sat near the front, his posture relaxed, his head tilted to listen with an attentiveness that seemed to drink in every word. Naomi found herself watching the interaction between the volunteers and the listeners, the way they leaned closer when speaking, the care in each gesture, and thought again of her project, of how spaces like this could be multiplied across the county if only they had the resources. When the last story was read, and the applause faded, people began to drift toward the cocoa table or the exits. Holt turned in his chair, his cane resting across his lap. "Would you join me for a cup of tea before you go?" he asked. His tone was casual, yet there was a quiet insistence in it, as if the invitation was as much about the company as the drink. Naomi hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I'd like that." They settled into a small alcove near the library's side windows, where a teapot and two mismatched cups waited on a low table. Outside, bare branches tapped lightly against the glass as the wind moved through them. Holt poured carefully, his hands sure despite the tremor that came with age, and slid a cup toward her. "I know a few books you might appreciate," he said, reaching into his tote again. He pulled out two worn hardcovers, one on inclusive design, the other a memoir by an advocate for disability rights. "They've been my companions for a while. Thought you might find some ideas in them." Holt rested his hands over his cane for a moment, tilting his head slightly. "What made you choose this work, Naomi? It's not the sort of project people take on unless it's personal." She let the question hang between them for a beat, eyes drifting to the steam curling from her tea. "When I was 60, my older brother had a car accident. He never walked again. We thought finding a school that would take him in would be simple. It wasn't. Doors closed, sometimes politely, sometimes not at all. I learned then how invisible people can become if a place isn't built for them." Her voice softened, steady but edged with memory. "I promised myself I'd work to change that, even if it was only in one town." Holt's expression didn't change much, but there was a pause, a stillness, that told her he was listening deeper than most. "That explains a lot," he said quietly, before lifting his cup again. Naomi traced a finger along the embossed title of the memoir. "Thank you, this means a lot." They talked for a short while, about the library's programs, the stubbornness of winter, the way the town seemed both small and endlessly full of strangers. Holt's voice carried a measured warmth, his words thoughtful without drifting into sentimentality. When Naomi finally stood to leave, she saw a woman in her 50s approaching from the lobby. She had an air of quiet assurance, her coat neatly buttoned, a soft scarf looped at her neck. "Ready to go, Dad?" she asked, her eyes shifting briefly to Naomi with a polite reserved smile. "This is," Holt began, but the woman gave a small nod that suggested introductions could wait. Naomi returned the nod, sensing an unspoken boundary, and stepped aside as they gathered Holt's things. She walked out into the chill afternoon, the sound of their quiet conversation fading behind her, unaware that this brief encounter had just shifted the path ahead in ways neither she nor Holt could yet imagine. 3 evenings later, Naomi was sorting through a small stack of printouts at her kitchen table when the phone rang. She almost didn't answer, thinking it might be another automated call, but the voice on the other end made her pause mid-breath. "Miss Naomi, this is Holt. I was wondering, would you care to join me for dinner sometime this week? Nothing fancy. I'd like to show you those books I mentioned." His tone was measured, the words deliberate, as if he wanted to give her an easy way to say no. She smiled into the receiver, even though he couldn't see it. "I'd be honored." That Friday, the sun dipped early, the cold returning with a sharper edge as she made her way up a narrow brick path toward a small well-kept house on the quieter side of town. Light spilled warmly from the front windows, soft and golden against the frost. She knocked gently, and almost at once, the door opened to reveal Holt, wearing a thick cardigan and a contented smile. Come in," he said, stepping aside so she could enter. The air inside carried the comforting aroma of baked bread, and something savory simmering, rosemary maybe, mingled with the earthy scent of roasted vegetables. The space felt lived in, shelves filled with books of every size and color, a low fire flickering in the hearth, a braided rug underfoot. "Ellen's just finishing in the kitchen," Holt said, leading her toward a small dining table set for 3. From the doorway came the woman Naomi had briefly seen at the library. Tonight she wore a simple navy sweater and a loosely tied apron, her dark hair pulled back. "You must be Naomi," she said, her voice pleasant but reserved. "I'm Ellen, Dad's daughter." They shook hands, and Naomi noticed the firm, assessing quality in Ellen's gaze, not unkind, but watchful, as though weighing what she saw. They sat down to a modest meal: roasted chicken with herbs, carrots glazed in honey, fresh bread still warm from the oven. Holt insisted she take the first slice, passing it carefully across the table. Conversation began with safe, gentle subjects: the stubborn cold snap, the way the snow had crusted hard over the sidewalks, the trouble of finding decent apples this time of year. It was only after a few minutes that Holt leaned back slightly, his fork resting beside his plate, and began sharing fragments of his life. He spoke of traveling in his younger years, of a time he worked with a community center that provided Braille classes and mobility training for newly blind adults. "It's not just about teaching them to read or navigate," he said. "It's about convincing them, and the rest of the world, that they still have a place." His voice carried a quiet conviction, the kind that came from seeing both the failures and triumphs of such work. Naomi listened intently, her mind catching on certain phrases. She told him, in turn, about her own project, the push to create spaces in public buildings designed with real accessibility in mind, not just the bare minimum required by law. She spoke of ramps that led to locked doors, of signs placed too high to be read from a wheelchair, of how small changes could mean independence for someone. She kept her tone measured, not turning it into a pitch, but there was no hiding the passion that colored her words. Ellen stayed mostly quiet, interjecting with a question now and then, about where Naomi grew up, how she became interested in this work, what she thought of the library's new programs. She offered no opinions of her own, but her eyes never seemed to leave Naomi's face for long, as though cataloging each answer. After the plates were cleared, Holt gestured toward the living room, where a low table near the fire now held a neat stack of books. Naomi followed him, kneeling beside the table as he picked up one volume after another: a history of disability rights legislation, a memoir by a war veteran who lost his sight, a collection of essays on inclusive city planning. Some were well worn, with creased spines and pages softened from years of turning. Others still had the crisp feel of newness. "These have been with me a long time," Holt said, resting a hand lightly on the top book. "They've shaped how I see the world, in every sense of the word." He smiled faintly at his own phrasing. Naomi ran her fingers over the braille on one cover, feeling the tiny raised dots under her skin. "I'll take good care of them," she promised. When it grew late, Ellen rose from her chair. "I can walk you to your car," she offered, her tone even. Outside, the night was clear, the air sharp in Naomi's lungs. Their footsteps crunched over the frosted path. At the curb, Ellen paused with one hand on her coat pocket. "Thank you for coming tonight. Dad doesn't invite many people over these days." Her words were polite, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, curiosity maybe, or caution. Naomi nodded, unsure what to say that wouldn't feel too formal. "I'm glad he called," she replied simply. She drove away with the image of the warm house lingering in her mind, Holt's voice steady in the firelight, Ellen's silent watchfulness across the table, the weight of the books on her lap like a promise. It never crossed her mind that the evening had planted something deeper, threads connecting them in ways still hidden, waiting for the right moment to surface. The morning of the announcement broke gray and windless, a pale winter light settling over the city like a sheet of frost. Naomi sat in the back of the bus, her hands folded in her lap, the motion of the wheels thrumming through her bones. She had told herself a dozen times she was only going to observe, to see how the process worked so she might prepare better next year. The truth, though, pressed against her ribs. She had fought hard for this project, and the thought of hearing another name called still carried its own quiet sting. The community hall was already buzzing when she arrived. Coats draped over chair backs, clusters of people speaking in low, eager tones, the smell of brewed coffee rising from a table near the back. Large banners hung from the rafters, "Innovation for Inclusion" printed in deep blue letters, and rows of folding chairs faced a modest stage with a podium and two simple spotlights. Naomi took a seat near the aisle, setting her tote bag at her feet. Her pulse beat faster than she wanted to admit. A man in a tailored suit stepped up to the microphone, his voice warm and practiced as he welcomed the attendees. He spoke of community spirit, of the remarkable number of proposals submitted this year, and of the honor of having a special guest share a few words before the results were announced. "Please join me in welcoming Mr. Holt Whitmore." Naomi blinked at the name, then found herself leaning forward as Holt stepped carefully onto the stage, guided by a volunteer. He wore a dark overcoat over a pressed shirt, the polished wood of his cane catching the light. The murmurs in the room hushed to near silence. Holt gripped the edges of the podium with steady hands, and after a brief pause, tilted his head toward the audience. "How many of you," he began, his voice carrying a quiet weight, "have ever been helped by a stranger, not in some grand way, just a small act, a hand offered when you needed it most?" For a moment the hall seemed to hold its breath. Naomi's gaze swept the rows, a few people nodded faintly, but no one spoke. The silence stretched, not uncomfortably, but with a kind of shared reflection. "I've had my share of both," Holt continued. "The quick distracted sort of help, given as though checking a box, and then the other kind, the help that comes with a steady hand, a real moment of presence. You know it when it happens, you feel it." He told them about the morning at the train station, how he had been shoved and disoriented, his cane caught in a gap, his balance faltering. "Someone reached for the cane," he said, "and handed it back without looking at me. I might have managed, or I might have gone down." He let the words settle, then went on. "But then another voice came, calm, steady, and the next thing I knew, I was being guided away from the rush, my bag over my shoulder, my steps matched to hers. No hurry, no fuss, just care." Naomi felt the heat rise to her cheeks, though no one in the hall could know it was her. She gripped the strap of her bag tighter, the memory flooding back, the sharp clatter of the train doors closing, the ache of missed opportunity already forming even as she smiled at him. Holt shifted his weight and spoke of another day, this time in the library. How a volunteer, well-meaning but careless, had dropped the contents of his bag, sending books scattering down the steps. "It happens," he said lightly, "but there's a difference between an apology thrown over a shoulder and a pair of hands that take the time to gather every page, to walk you down each stair without rushing." Naomi's throat tightened. She had not thought of those two moments as linked, but hearing them placed side by side, she could see the thread Holt was drawing. "I've lived long enough," Holt said finally, "to know that we build communities on these small unseen acts. You may forget the details, but you will remember how it felt to be treated as if you mattered." His fingers tapped the wood of the podium once, softly, as if to mark the point. The applause began tentatively, then grew until it filled the space. Some stood. Holt inclined his head in thanks, stepping back as the volunteer returned to guide him down the steps. Naomi watched him move through the aisle, his expression calm but tinged with something, satisfaction, maybe, or relief. When the room settled again, the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore, for those powerful words. And now," he said, a note of ceremony in his voice, "we invite one of our distinguished selection committee members to present this year's awardees." From the side of the stage, Ellen appeared, dressed in a charcoal blazer and carrying a folder. Naomi's breath caught in surprise. She had known Ellen only as Holt's daughter, the quiet woman with the level gaze across a dinner table. Now she crossed the stage with measured steps, unfolding the sheet of paper before her. "This year," Ellen began, her voice steady but warm, "we received an extraordinary range of proposals, each reflecting dedication, insight, and the belief that inclusion is not just a policy but a practice." She glanced briefly toward the audience, her eyes passing over Naomi without pause. "It is my honor to announce that one of our 3-year funding grants will go to a project that not only meets the criteria but challenges us to see public spaces with new eyes." Naomi's ears roared with the blood pounding in them. She barely registered the first part of the sentence that followed, but the last words came through with sharp clarity, "and that project belongs to Naomi Clark." For a moment she sat perfectly still, the name sounding strange when lifted into the air like that. Then she rose, the applause washing toward her in a wave, her legs carrying her forward almost on their own. Somewhere beyond the lights, Holt was smiling, and Ellen's expression was unreadable, not cold, not exactly warm, but intent, as though this was a moment she had known was coming. The first gathering funded by the grant was supposed to be just that, the first gathering. Naomi had imagined herself moving quietly in the background, making sure the coffee stayed hot, the Braille booklets were stacked neatly on the table, the ramps and aisles kept clear. She had dressed simply, hair pulled back, name tag clipped to her sweater like any other volunteer. This was for the community, not for her. The hall buzzed with life, laughter rose from the corner where children tested out the new tactile picture books. A woman ran her fingers over a Braille sign and smiled. Holt sat in the second row, his cane resting across his knees, Ellen beside him with that same unreadable calm Naomi had seen at the dinner table. Naomi felt a quiet pride, not in herself, but in the space, in the fact that people had come. She was carrying a box of audio headsets toward the back when she heard her name from the stage. It wasn't the clipped tone of a roll call, it was an invitation. She froze for a second, the box still in her arms, thinking there must be another Naomi. But the host was looking right at her, smiling warmly. "Naomi, would you join us up here?" Heat rushed to her face. She set the box down carefully, smoothed her sweater, and walked toward the front, her pulse loud in her ears. She had no speech prepared, no reason to stand under those lights. The host began speaking, words tumbling into the air about vision, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to dignity. Naomi's eyes darted to Holt, who was smiling faintly, and she realized this was not an accident. One by one, people rose from their chairs. A man with a guide dog spoke about feeling seen for the first time in years. A teacher from the library described the new programs already taking shape. A young woman in a wheelchair shared how the space had given her a sense of independence she hadn't felt in a long time. Naomi stood still, hands clasped in front of her, the shock still sitting heavy in her chest. She had not expected any of this. Then Holt came to the microphone. His voice was calm but carried the weight of memory. He told of a morning at a crowded train station, of a cane caught in the floor, and a stranger who chose to stop. He spoke of a day in the library when a careless hand nearly sent him tumbling, and the same stranger's steady grip had kept him safe. "It is not the size of the help that matters," he said, "but the care behind it. And that care, it grows." By the time the speeches ended, Naomi felt almost lightheaded, a mix of embarrassment, gratitude and disbelief. She moved down from the stage, as the audience began to drift toward the doors, still trying to process what had just happened. Then a small voice called her name. She turned and saw the boy from the library, the one in the wheelchair, wheeling himself forward with quiet determination. He held a microphone in both hands, his fingers wrapped tightly around it. Lifting his chin, he spoke into it with a clarity that cut through the room. "Thank you, Miss Naomi." Her breath caught. She hadn't realized until that moment how much those words would mean. She crouched beside him, taking his hand gently. His skin was warm, his grip surprisingly firm. She felt the sting of tears but didn't look away. Somewhere behind them, cameras clicked. But Naomi wasn't thinking of photographs or audiences. She was thinking of the train station. The library steps, every choice that had seemed small at the time, now standing before her in the shape of this boy's steady gaze. The image lingered, her head bent toward his hand in hers, before the room slowly faded to black in the mind's eye, leaving only the quiet certainty that kindness had a way of circling back, often when you least expected it.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.